When preparing residential building plans, one of the most important steps is understanding the zoning rules that apply to the property. These rules determine not only what may be built on the land, but also the limits within which buildings must be designed. For most suburban properties, for instance in Cape Town, that are smaller than 1,000 square meters, the applicable zoning is typically a form of single residential zoning. While there are several subcategories within this zoning, the fundamental development parameters are broadly similar. The first parameter to consider is the number of dwellings permitted on the property. In most single residential zones, the primary development right is one dwelling house per ERF. A dwelling house is defined as a freestanding building designed to accommodate a single household. In addition to the main dwelling, many residential properties are also permitted to accommodate a second dwelling. This second dwelling may take the form of a garden cottage, granny flat, or backyard unit. The second dwelling must remain subordinate to the main house and must comply with the general development controls that apply to the property. The next important control relates to building lines. Building lines determine how far buildings must be set back from the boundaries of the property. These setbacks help ensure that residential areas retain adequate space, privacy, and access to light and ventilation. For most residential urban, under 1,000 square meters, the street building line is typically 4.5 meters from the street boundary. This means that no part of the building may be constructed closer than 4.5 meters to the street boundary unless specific relaxation or departure approvals are granted. Along the side boundaries of the property, the lateral building line is typically 1.5 meters. This creates space between neighboring buildings and allows access for maintenance and services. At the rear boundary of the property, the setback is generally 3 meters. This provides additional open space at the back of the ERF and helps prevent excessive building bulk. Another key parameter is site coverage. Coverage refers to the proportion of the site that may be occupied by buildings. For many single residential properties smaller than 1,000 square meters, the typical maximum coverage is 50% of the site area. This means that the combined footprint of all buildings on the property may not exceed half of the total ERF area. Coverage controls are important because they ensure that residential properties retain adequate open space for gardens, drainage, landscaping, and outdoor living. In addition to coverage, zoning also regulates the height of buildings. In most single residential zones, the maximum building height is generally limited to 2 stories or approximately 8 meters above natural ground level. Height limits help maintain the scale of suburban neighborhoods and prevent excessive overshadowing of neighboring properties. Another important control is the floor factor. Floor factor refers to the total floor area of all buildings on the property expressed as a proportion of the site area. For many residential urban under 1,000 square meters, the floor factor limit is approximately 1.0. This means that the total floor area of all buildings on the site may be roughly equal to the size of the ERF. For example, a property measuring 500 square meters could potentially accommodate approximately 500 square meters of total floor area, subject to the other development controls such as coverage and height. Parking and access are also important components of residential zoning. Each dwelling unit on a property must normally be provided with parking spaces on the site itself. These parking spaces may be accommodated within garages, carports, or open parking bays. Where a second dwelling is provided, additional parking is typically required to ensure that residential streets are not overloaded with parked vehicles. Access to the property is usually provided by means of a driveway crossing from the street. In most cases, only one vehicle access point is permitted along the street frontage. This helps maintain pedestrian safety and limits excessive interruption of sidewalks. Driveway widths are typically restricted so that the majority of the street boundary can remain available for landscaping, boundary walls, and pedestrian movement. Garages and carports are also subject to certain setback rules. In many cases, garages must be positioned behind the street building line unless specific relaxation is granted. This helps maintain a consistent building line along residential streets and prevents garages from dominating the street frontage. Another important consideration relates to corner properties. Properties located on street corners are usually subject to two street building lines, one along each street boundary. This ensures that adequate visibility and spatial openness are maintained at road intersections. Outbuildings and accessory structures must also comply with the applicable development controls. Structures such as domestic quarters, storage rooms, and small outbuildings are typically permitted, but they must respect the building lines, coverage limits, and height restrictions that apply to the property. Boundary walls are also regulated. Along street boundaries, boundary walls are generally limited in height in order to maintain visibility and contribute to the visual quality of residential streets. Higher boundary walls may be permitted along internal property boundaries. Finally, it is important to remember that zoning compliance is only one part of the development process. Even when a building proposal complies fully with zoning rules such as building lines, coverage limits, height restrictions, and the permitted number of dwellings, the building plans must still comply with the national building regulations and the relevant construction standards. These regulations deal with structural safety, fire protection, drainage, ventilation, and other technical aspects of building design. For homeowners and building professionals alike, understanding these residential zoning parameters provides the foundation for successful development. By working within the limits set by building lines, coverage, height, floor factor, and access requirements, it becomes possible to design homes that comply with municipal regulations while also creating comfortable and functional living environments. In summary, residential zoning establishes the framework within which houses and residential properties may be developed. It defines how many dwellings may be built, how buildings must be positioned on a site, how large they may be, and how access and parking must be arranged. Understanding these rules at the outset of a project allows building plans to be prepared efficiently and ensures that development contributes positively to the surrounding neighborhood.